All right, everybody, welcome back to the Skeptic Fence Show, and tonight's guest is Dr. Andrew Newberg. His website is www.andrewnewberg.com, and his latest book is The Metaphysical Mind, Probing the Biology of Philosophical Thought. Brief description on that book is how are philosophical and theological concepts conceived in the mind? Why are certain topics of greater importance to philosophers and theologians? Why do we think about these issues in the first place? These are questions that are explored in the groundbreaking book, The Metaphysical Mind. Dr. Andrew Newberg, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you on the show tonight.
Thank you for having me on your program.
And what do you like to be called, Dr. Newberg, Andrew, Andy?
I respond to everything.
All right, great.
Awesome. Andrew's fine.
Andrew's fine. All right, great. And Drew, I think we have a little short bio here so people could get to know who Andrew Newberg is.
Right. Dr. Andrew Newberg is the Director of Research at the Jefferson Marina Bren Center of Integrative Medicine and a physician at Jefferson University Hospital. He is board certified in internal medicine, nuclear medicine, and nuclear cardiology. Andrew has been asking questions about reality, truth, and God since he was very young, and has long been fascinated by the human mind and its complex workings. While a medical student, he and Dr. Eugene Diachile, who was studying religious experiences. Combining their interests with Andrew's background in neuroscience and brain imaging, they were able to break new theoretical and empirical ground on the relationship between the brain and religion. Andrew's research now largely focuses on how brain function is associated with various mental states, in particular, religious and mystical experiences. His research has included brain scans of people in prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states, as well as surveys of people's spiritual experiences and attitudes. He has also evaluated the relationship between religious and spiritual phenomena and health, and the effect of meditation on memory. He believes that it is important to keep science rigorous and religion religious. He has also used neuroimaging research projects to study aging and dementia, Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, depression, and other neurological and psychiatric disorders.
Awesome. Thank you, Drew, for that. Quick question here. Actually, what I want to do here, Andrew, before we get started here is, with the Q&A, I should say, I want your professional opinion on something here. Would this audio clip be considered as talking in tongues, but to Satan? Okay, to Satan, not God. Okay, here we go. So what's your professional opinion on that?
Well, it's a tough one. I guess it depends on what happened to the person after he did that.
All right, that's a good answer. I like that. All right, first question I got real quick here is I like people to get to know who our guests are if they've never heard of them before. So please give us a little background on who Andrew Newberg is, religious and professional aspects, of course. What religion were you raised in, and what are you now? And why did you choose the profession that you did?
Well, there's a lot of good questions. I guess I was raised in a Reformed Jewish household, so I got bar mitzvahed when I was 13. But we weren't particularly religious. There was a lot of interest in questioning all different aspects of God and religion, and of course, I was encouraged to explore a lot of different ideas and a lot of different perspectives on things. And I guess as I started to grow up and started to look around, I was always very intrigued by the idea that there were so many different religious traditions, so many different philosophical traditions, different political positions, and was always a little upset about how much hatred there was between people when they had differences of opinion. Ultimately, I kind of felt like, well, we're all looking at the same world, so yeah, even though we may come to some different conclusions about it, I felt like we were all kind of in the same basic place, trying to do the best that we could at trying to understand our world around us, and maybe we needed to be a little bit more respectful and a little bit more understanding of people who come to conclusions that are different from us. But it also encouraged me to say, well, but why are there so many different opinions? Where are these all coming from? And as I grew up, I realized that science, I thought, was going to be a very important path to helping us understand these questions. Certainly, looking at the human brain was going to be a very, very important piece, because obviously it's our brain that helps us to come up with all these different ideas and all these different beliefs that we hold, different perceptions about the world around us. But as I grew up, as I went through college and ultimately heading into medical school, I started to realize that as great as science was and how much I love science, there were certain kind of big philosophical questions that science could help us with, but didn't seem like it could quite get all the way there. And I started
Yeah.
to look at different philosophical traditions, different, all the way from Aristotle to Nietzsche to Kant, and all the way up into the last century in terms of philosophy and modern philosophy. So as I questioned all of these things, as I looked at these different philosophical traditions, I also started to explore what Buddhist and Hindu philosophies had to say, Christian, Judaism, Islam, all the different perspectives. And I guess all this stuff just kind of floated around in my own brain as I went through my training. I entered into medical school and, of course, had to learn all the basic background for that. And a real kind of important critical year for me was actually in my third year of medical school, where I did what they called an extra year or a year out, where I could just do some research and kind of explore different ideas and different things on my own and hopefully develop that into a career. And I met two really wonderful people. One of them was a Dr. Abbas Alabi, who was at the University of Pennsylvania, who was an imager. And he taught me a lot about brain imaging, and we used imaging to study all different kinds of diseases, disorders like Alzheimer's and schizophrenia and so forth. And I also met at the same time a psychiatrist who was working at Penn named Eugene DeQuilly, who had been also very interested in a lot of the same basic questions, trying to understand reality, the nature of religious and spiritual experiences, and so forth. And as those two things kind of came together, I realized that we ultimately had the opportunity to utilize the imaging studies to tell us what's going on inside the brain of people as they engage reality, and specifically as they engage reality in a spiritual context. So people who are doing prayer, meditation, speaking in tongues, as you mentioned, all these very unusual and interesting practices that people do to kind of connect them to some part of the world. What's going on in the brain? And from there, of course, we had research studies that included data that we could look at and tell us what was going on in the brain. But I also kept thinking that it had to kind of keep being integrated back into how we think about things philosophically, metaphysically, and so forth. And that's what ultimately kind of led me down a variety of paths, writing several different books about the brain and religion, and the most recent one about philosophy, about how we think about these things, how we think about metaphysics, how we think about reality, morals, and ethics, and what our brain is doing as we start to focus on these different ideas. Are there specific types of brain patterns or processes that push us in certain directions, that enable us to explore certain questions, that restrict us from exploring certain questions or certain ideas? And to me, this is just a continued natural outgrowth of my own path, which I guess is kind of a combination of a spiritual and scientific path, and however you ultimately want to define these different terms. Maybe we'll talk about that.
No, absolutely.
But that's where I've been and where I hope to keep going.
Awesome. No, well said, man. Wow, that was really intrigued by that, man. I was like, really,
Yeah.
but yeah, well said. I got another question here. My next question is, your book, your new book, of course, which is, of course, I'm going to say here, The Metaphysical Mind. What were the other questions that you asked yourself when you were making this book? I know you already touched on a couple already, but if you want to expand a little bit on that.
Sure. Well, for me, I think there were a couple of main questions, and I think the first one really came about as you look at the whole history of philosophy, and just like with different religions, different political systems, there's different ideas that people come up with. People look at philosophical ideas in a very rational way, in a very emotional way, in the context of a holistic approach, a very existential approach. Well, what's happening? How does our brain process all these different ideas? So I think the fundamental question I had was, how does our brain enable us to start to think about philosophy and to think about these big, the big questions? Why are we here? How do we understand the world around us? How do we make sense of that world? How do we know what's real or what's not real? Why do we God or don't believe in God? All these kind of big questions. So how does our brain help us to make those assessments, make those distinctions, process through all these different ideas, and ultimately come to some belief system, some conclusion that works for each individual person? And of course, each person does come to a variety of different conclusions, maybe even different conclusions throughout their life. They may think one thing when they're a kid, another thing when they're in college, something else when they get older. So how does our brain kind of flow with us as we begin to think through all these different ideas? And to kind of expand on that, then, are there certain ways in which our brain helps us to process those kinds of questions? And are there certain ways in which the brain restricts us? So, for example, if our brain, I always have this sort of mental, picture. What if you had a person whose brain didn't have the ability to perceive causality in the world?
Yeah.
What would their philosophy be like? Obviously causality has been a huge part of almost,
It's
many
a big debate. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Aristotle and his four causes, four causalities, what would happen, and how would they look at the world? Again, it originally sometimes started from a religious or spiritual perspective. Sometimes people think that God is the cause of all things. So again, if you didn't have this causal process in the brain, then they'd have to think about God in a very different way. When we look at science, we look at what causes different things to happen. What happens? How the different forces cause different things to happen, the Earth to go around the sun and so forth.
Yeah.
So, but that's because our brain wants to see these things, wants to understand these things, and can see those things. And again, that then gets to kind of the bigger question, which is how does all of this tell us what is really real? How can we use this information to maybe someday really be able to answer that question? Because if we see causality in the world, is that because our brain is set up that way to see causality, or is it because there's really causality out there and our brain has kind of been built so that it can see that? And I think those are a couple of the main questions that I had, and then trying to break it down into all those individual processes to help us kind of think through these different philosophical systems.
Wow, great. Yeah, absolutely, man. That's great. My next question I have for you is, and we'll get into the viewer submission questions, I guess, towards the end. I'll let these guys go soon here. I guess my next question or statement would be this, and I got about two more left myself, is, now, and this might be a personal, this might be not such a professional type of answer I want from you. You could do personal and professional, I could say, at this, because I think you probably split them up somewhat, right, or no?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Okay,
absolutely.
that's why I figured.
They're also woven together.
Yeah, and also woven together, correct. My statement here, question would be, let's look at, say, a devout Christian, a religious person, somebody that gets pretty emotional over their faith at times. People that, or a person that actually literally believes the creation story of Adam and Eve, the resurrection, divinity of Christ, etc. But they function fine in their day-to-day living, work amongst society when their religion doesn't have any role to play. Do you think this type of belief can make one lose the sense of oneself in reality at times? Or if it does, or when they do lose a sense of reality, I should say, when it comes to their faith, can this be beneficial and or dangerous a belief to adhere to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the answer is sort of yes to both. I mean, one of the intriguing problems I think that comes out of this whole field of research. In fact, some people also refer to this specific area as neurotheology, and maybe we'll address that in more detail a little later on. But I think it's a fascinating issue and a big problem when it comes to what religious and spiritual ideas do for people. How do we decide if they're good or bad? How do we decide whether they are beneficial or detrimental to a person? And again, this actually becomes kind of a bigger metaphysical, philosophical question.
Oh yes, let's load it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's take somebody who straps a bomb around their chest and walks into a crowded bus station because they feel that these people are non-believers. Well, obviously we would all look at that and say, well, that's horrible, and this is just it's crazy religion, and how can this person do that? From that person's perspective, they're not only doing the right thing, but they're doing the beneficial thing for themselves. Yeah. Now, obviously I have a lot of trouble with that, but you have, as a person trying to look at all these different perspectives and trying to understand them, it really, there's a huge variability. There's a huge continuum of these experiences that range from the extremely destructive to the incredibly constructive. And as you mentioned, I mean, I've in my travels and my studies and so forth, I've seen lots of people who engage in practices that seem extremely unusual and very bizarre and weird, and then but they have a family, and they have great kids who are going to college, and they work, and they have, and their spirituality though is still part of that life, and that they derive strength from it, and they derive consolation from it, and
Comfort,
they use it for their coping in life. So, it becomes very difficult to say, well, that's an abnormal belief or a normal belief. And psychiatry has actually struggled with this as well, because, first of all, a lot depends on just how you inherently define things. So if you define anyone who hears a voice as crazy, then anyone who says, I've heard the voice of God, whether they mean it in a very schizophrenic, psychotic sense, or in, as a preacher may say, I've heard, the voice of God, or I've understood certain ideas from God. Where do we draw that line between somebody who is really crazy versus somebody
that's exactly that's
it's a very big problem. It's very difficult to know. And like one of my favorite my colleague of mine pointed this out to me in the last diagnostic and statistical manual that comes out from the psychiatry field. When people have a spouse that has died, a very common thing is to see the spouse after they've died, and they call that a bereavement hallucination. But in the DSM, they actually define, because actually research studies have shown that those people who have that hallucination actually cope substantially better than those people who don't have that. They derive comfort from it. They feel connected to their loved one and so forth, and they do better. They get over this trauma.
I read about that. Yep.
Yeah, and they actually define it as a normal hallucination. Now that's kind of a weird statement. That's kind of the oxymoron.
It is. Yeah.
How do you have a hallucination which is normal? But so again, when you start to then extrapolate this to religious beliefs or political beliefs or philosophical ideas, when somebody comes up with some new way of thinking about metaphysics or about reality or something like that, who's to say who's right and who's wrong, and whether or not one of these people who we've declared as schizophrenic, who is in the mental institution, really is the Messiah, or really is someone who has achieved a different state of enlightenment or something like that. It's a tough question to answer. I mean,
it is, and at one point I want to bring up to you is like the talking in tongues thing. It's like I proposed a question to a couple of theists out there, and I basically said I think it's silly. I know people. I don't know how people really sincerely believe they are talking to God or the Holy Spirit. But the funny thing about this is you never see a non-religious person just all of a sudden start talking in tongues in the public eye, and you never see a devout Christian, let's say in Walmart, speaking in tongues. You don't see that happening. You never hear that happening. But the funny thing is, most believers in society would deem that Walmart person crazy, but that's a typical behavior, and it's accepted in church. Funny how that works. It's funny how you look at that type of stuff.
Well, and also, here's another little interesting twist on the whole thing. So take speaking in tongues. You can approach this from a very scientific perspective and say, okay, well, what kind of a state is it? We've done brain scans, and we show that there's differences in the brain and so forth. Is it a trance state? Is it a psychotic state? Is it, a normal spiritual state or whatever? But then theologically, there are people who feel that speaking in tongues is either the work of God and the Spirit of God moving through them, and other people feel that it is the work of the devil.
Yeah.
Like the audio that you played at the very beginning. I mean, some people think that it is completely wrong purely from a religious perspective. Forget the whole, are they crazy or not? So, it's really amazing how many different perspectives there are, and that's part of what I think this whole field needs to ultimately embrace. This field of neurotheology needs to embrace, or neurophilosophy. That we need to not just go from science to metaphysics and spirituality, but we need to kind of think about how they all interact with each other, because it's very complex and it gets very dicey in there.
Exactly. And real quick let's expand on that, because that was actually one of my questions is, give us a brief description if you can make it brief. Like, what is neurotheology? I know it's not new, but I think you're one of the pioneers, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I've certainly been involved in it since it really has started to develop. Well, to me, I mean, very simplistically speaking, neurotheology is looking at, is a field of scholarship that looks at the relationship between the brain and spirituality. For me to make neurotheology work as a term, and I've struggled with it a lot, and in fact, actually, I wound up writing a book called Principles of Neurotheology because I felt like, you know, somebody needed to at least say something about what it is and try to outline what it can be. For me as a term to work, I think I always define the neuro side and the theology side very, very broadly. So the neuro side includes cognitive neuroscience and psychology and anthropology and so forth. And the theology side is obviously not just theology, but spirituality and religion and different practices like meditation and prayer and the study of all of those different things. So if you kind of define both terms very broadly,
Yeah.
and as I was mentioning a minute ago, that, you know, it's kind of a two-way street. It's not just science looking at religion and spirituality, but how they can both help us to understand each other a little bit better. Then I think it may work as a term. But it's still in its infancy, and we certainly have a long way to go in terms of making it a true field of scholarship.
Awesome, man. Well said. And I know TJ has a question that sort of goes along with that later on. My next question here, I got probably two more questions, and I'll let TJ go, then Drew, and then I'll come back with the viewer submission questions. The next two are pretty sensitive topics, I think, to a certain point. Not so much the next one, but the one after that. This one pertains to, I guess you could say, the concept of sin and forgiveness, the religious concepts of sin and forgiveness, the threat of eternal damnation. We are all sinners. Repent, ask for forgiveness, or you go to hell, so on and so forth. I personally see sin and forgiveness, the concept of it, as a rinse and repeat process. I've experienced this with my wife, and I will forward you my series with my wife, because religion actually harmed her more than it helped her, I think. So I will forward you that, my experience, that my series is about 90 minutes long. Most Christians seem to think it's okay to sin because forgiveness is just so easy, in my opinion, it seems. What are your thoughts on this concept, sin and forgiveness? Have you ever studied this issue? Again, beneficial or harmful, or harmful?
I haven't specifically studied the concept of sin quite as much as I have done some work looking at forgiveness and the forgiveness process, which in and of itself is kind of interesting. But just going back to the larger question that you raise, I mean, I think there are some really critical issues here where religious and spiritual ideas and doctrines and practices can be very detrimental to people. They can be very destructive. They can be very limiting. They can, you know, really affect the way a person looks at the world, and does so in a very negative kind of way. And of course, it can be very positive and very wonderful for people. So, and I think to some degree, since we're all our own individuals, we all come from our different backgrounds. We have different brains with different amounts of serotonin and dopamine and all that. It's always a little tricky to know what kind of belief system, what kind of idea actually works best for one person or another. Now, but I agree with you. I mean, ultimately, when it comes to certain ideas about, for example, what we should be able to do morally or not, you know, sometimes people don't take enough responsibility or don't look at the causality of the different elements in terms of how different ideas or different problems have occurred in the world, and hence wind up needing some sort of, you know, easy way out, if you will, which can be forgiveness. Now, of course, forgiveness is a crucial process for humanity. I mean, we need to be able, you know, you need to be able to forgive your wife. More likely, she needs to be able to forgive you. And you know, it's always essential for us to all be able to appreciate a person who has done something wrong and try to find a way to get them redirected in the right path. So, you know, forgiveness is a great thing, but it also can have it, you know, it depends on how it's executed and how it's used and whether it's used appropriately or not. You know, ultimately, if there are people who have such strong antagonistic beliefs about people, it becomes very difficult to know how to forgive another person. But interestingly, I mean, I think the forgiveness process is something which does involve of complex brain mechanisms.
Yeah.
General, what I think is happening is that when an injury has occurred to an individual, you feel that injury. You have to have a memory and kind of a causal analysis of that injury to know who was the one who did the injury to you, and then you ultimately have to kind of process through that to re-equilibrate the situation. And whether you do that in a spiritual way, that, well, look, God's gonna, God is gonna forgive that person if they want, so I'll forgive the person. That's, one option.
Yeah.
Another option is, well, we're all human, we all make mistakes, so I can forgive that person. There's a variety of different approaches that people can take towards forgiveness, but I think we always have to be cautious about how we utilize these different processes, and whether or not they ultimately foster good behaviors or bad behaviors. And if, as you said, if it's this sort of cycle of sin and forgiveness, where a person just keeps going out and hurting people, well, that's not a very adaptive kind of approach. Whereas, if a person has made a mistake and they want to try to rectify it, and they are asking for somebody's forgiveness, and they get it, and then they can move forward in a job, a marriage, whatever.
Yeah.
Then it can be extremely beneficial.
I agree with you there, like 100% agree with you, because that's what the conversation I used to have with my wife. Like, she used to sin, I ask God for forgiveness, and just rinse and repeat, just keep on doing it. That's why I call it rinse and repeat, just keep on doing it. And it just, but some of the stuff, the sins really hurt her, and like other people too, but if it hurts you, and you it's just really irritated me sometimes. But like you said too, also, religion can do good for people. There's no doubt. I'm like, like you explained about maybe 10 minutes ago, it does. I know, I do accept that it does do good for people that are just living with like the death of a family member. Yes, of course, that's good. That's a great aspect. Of course, if you can have your religion, that's fine. Have it, and just if it makes you feel better, I'm all for it, hands down. Only problem I have with religion, which many of us probably here do, is when it's involved in society, when it comes to education, politics, and so on and so forth.
Sure.
But that being said, my last question here, and I'll let TJ go on here, is, and this is a very serious question. I don't know if you're familiar with the YouTube community, Facebook, and all that, but a lot of people deem religion as a mental illness. You hear this all the time, and I used to think this myself as of about, I guess, a year ago. I used to think this myself, but with me, it was always case by case. You know what I mean? And I hear a lot of people claiming that religion is mental illness. And Kathleen Taylor, neuroscientist, I don't know if you're familiar with her, she came out with this study saying basically religious fundamentalism can be treated as a mental illness. What are your thoughts about this? Is religion a mental illness? Can it be deemed as a mental illness maybe in the future? Isn't, just expand on it a little bit. And what are your thoughts on this whole, or religion as a mental illness?
Sure. Well, I don't know if the listeners know, but I was in Bill Maher's movie Religulous, and he asked, he said, well, could all these people be crazy? And I said, well, it depends on how you define crazy. We're all crazy. We all have beliefs. We all hold on to certain ideas about the world that make sense to us, and we hope make sense to other people, and we hope ultimately are effective for us. So, part of I think that certainly when you have religious ideas that become detrimental for the individual, detrimental for society, I think that, certainly that can be considered to be some type of mental illness. It's a problem for that individual that hopefully can, be redirected in a positive direction. As somebody who is depressed,
correct,
we try to redirect them into a more, positive outlook on the world. So if somebody is very hate-filled and very, wanting to destroy other people because they don't agree with them, hopefully we can find ways of utilizing these different ideas in a positive way and redirect them into something that's beneficial. But I think, as you also mentioned, I think it has to be thought about to some degree on a case-by-case basis. Some of the most wonderful people who I've ever met, you look at, I've had wonderful experience in hospitals with pastoral care people. These are some of the most incredible people who are open to every tradition, who help everybody, irrespective of their belief systems, and yet they hold a very religious and spiritual perspective on the world, and that's part of what has enabled them to be that way. And they are some of the most adaptive, most wonderful, most loving people I've ever met. So, and there's plenty of wonderful, loving atheists, and there's, it really, I don't think it's just the religious piece that ultimately creates the problem. And in fact, one of the key areas where I think, or at least I hope that neurotheology as a field can address is this question: why is it that one very religious person becomes enormously loving and compassionate and open to other people and other ideas and beliefs, while another person who claims to be equally religious, is willing to strap a bomb around their chest and because they don't like the way they believe. To me, part of it is the religious beliefs, but part of it,
How about the indoctrination process, maybe?
Well, yeah, but I mean, ultimately, part of it too is, would you, for example, would I even go into a direction like that? I mean, if I started hearing that kind of negativity and that kind of hatred, I mean, I couldn't even tolerate it.
Oh, no way.
There's some people who can and like it, or feel comforted by it in some way or another.
I think society might have something to play with that too. If you look at the bombers like over in the Middle East and stuff like that. No?
Well, absolutely, and again, whether being religious is adaptive or not, studies have shown that it depends on society. I mean, here in the United States, where a large percentage of people are religious, being religious is generally, a beneficial thing for people. They do very well with it. If you go back to places like China or the old Soviet Union, where you weren't allowed to be religious, then being religious was really maladaptive, and it was very difficult. They were persecuted. They were often depressed. They were anxious. So there's so many different factors that go into what religion ultimately is for any given individual and what it means for the people who believe in those ideas. But again, on the other hand, I guess part of my perspective on this, and this gets into the metaphysical mind piece, is that all of us have a brain that's looking out on this world and trying to make some sense out of it. And it's an infinite world. We have an extraordinarily finite brain that makes all kinds of mistakes, and yet somehow we have to hope that we've got some sense as to what we should be doing in the world.
Exactly.
Hope that it's right and works. So when we fall into a philosophical system, a political system, a religious system, where we say, this makes some sense to me, I get it, I can live my life by it, then that's what we gravitate to. And then, of course, once we connect with those beliefs, they get written into the wiring of the brain, and as you were mentioning with your wife or whatever, they become very difficult to break out of. And of course, if they're detrimental, it's really a problem.
Yeah, deconversions could be a bitch.
Absolutely. All
right, I'm going to hand this over to Coctopus, but right before you go, Coctopus, I want to say that we're talking to Dr. Andrew Newberg here. His website is www.andrewnewberg.com, and his latest book is The Metaphysical Mind, Probing the Biology of Philosophical Thought. TJ, take it over, man.
All right. How you doing? I'll just call you Dr. Newberg. I like that.
Whatever you're comfortable with is fine.
All right. Well, I'm known on this show for kind of, asking the hard-hitting questions, so please forgive me. But I know that you're an expert on, the neural effects of talking in tongues. So in your professional opinion, how active are my frontal lobes when I say something like, yippee skippy, schmingy jingy, ramalama ding dong, super duper ping pong, pitty patty, uber goober, pooper scooper rat tat tat, hoobita doobita dink, decalopotamus fatty boom boom, pimpopolis, lickety splickety gobbledygoo?
Well, that's a very good question. The short answer is I don't know.
I think I might have to give you a brain scan.
But you got to come in and do it again when I can see your brain exactly.
All right, we'll set an appointment for that later.
I think a question similar to that.
Okay, maybe here's a question.
You're raising a great point. We studied people who were speaking in tongues as part of their religious and spiritual tradition. The comparison for that was normal speaking. And of course, that raises the question, well, what is the appropriate? This is actually, I've gotten very interested in all of the methodological challenges of doing this kind of research. There's a lot of different comparison states that one could think of, and one of them is speaking gibberish, and doing what you just did. And there have been a couple of studies that have looked at it that don't show the exact same pattern that we saw with the speaking in tongues. But of course, one of the real questions still is, what are these things? When somebody is speaking in tongues and I get a brain scan, does that mean that I have, what have I captured? And I always say, look, I try to be true to the science. When I see a brain scan of somebody speaking in tongues, it tells me what their brain is doing when they're speaking in tongues. It doesn't lead me to the conclusion that it's totally confabulation. It doesn't lead me to the conclusion that God is in the room with them. It does, it only shows what the brain is doing. It's hard to then make that next leap and say, this is why it's happening. And so again, I also recognize that people can take it in lots of different directions, and that's fine. That's part of what science and these kinds of discussions are all about. But it does raise a very important, challenging question, which is, what's the reality of it? Is this just crazy, or is it real? Is it something?
So you guys are yet to like try and test somebody that's making it up, that.
Yeah.
I think that would be interesting.
There was one study that was done where they actually had people try to fake it, so to speak.
Oh, yeah, that was your question, yeah.
And again, what they saw were certain similarities, but also certain differences. And, one of the studies that I did that, I don't know if you guys have heard about this one, but we studied a group of Brazilian mediums. And this was a really interesting study because it kind of addressed the question that you're asking a little bit more specifically. So we had these Brazilian mediums who, connect to the spirits around them, and then they would write stuff down. And what was interesting was that when we broke them down into those who were novices and those who were considered experts in this group, we found that there was a difference, that the people who were the experts had a different brain pattern than the people who were novices. They were both doing the same thing. So then the question is one just making it up, and the other one is, doing it for real, whatever that means? Are they simply doing it in different ways? And, the analogy that I might throw out also, which I think is probably a valid one, is music. When you first learn how to play a piano, for example, you've got to concentrate on every note that you play as you play it. But as you get good, it becomes much more automatic. And then, of course, when you get really good, you can improvise and just, do whatever you feel like doing. And when you're improvising, what's interesting is that your frontal lobe activity actually starts to shut down, just like what we saw in the people who were speaking in tongues, or also in the expert mediums. So, and when people are doing the gibberish, I think part of it is that it depends a little bit on how purposefully you're doing it versus how much you're really just letting yourself go with it. And
That's
if you
cool.
go, you might actually have a very similar kind of brain pattern to the people who were speaking in tongues.
That's really crazy. I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation already. Do you find it interesting or strange that people tend to some people focus so much on like one verse of scripture? Like the talking in tongues is based off one verse, and the serpent handling is based on one verse. And do you find it interesting or strange that people can devote so much of their life to one line in one book?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and it does, but there's a certain sense that it makes also with regard to how the brain works. One of my late colleague Gene DeQuilly and I, we started with a lot of this discussion looking at anthropology and looking at rituals. And the key to rituals is that they're repetitive, and specifically that you repeat the same thing over and over again. Now, why is that good? Well, it does a couple things in the brain. First of all, there's a cute phrase about how the brain works. Neurons that fire together wire together. And what that means is that if you focus on that particular phrase, on God is one, or whatever it is, then that idea, that concept, that phrase gets reinforced in your brain and makes it a stronger and stronger part of your whole belief system.
Almost like being hardwired.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it really it changes the way your brain works. And we have other studies which have shown that simple practices like mantra-based practices where you repeat the same phrases over and over again change your brain, and change even in a short period of time, like 8 weeks or so. So you can imagine what's happening if somebody's doing these practices for years. But also what happens is that as you do this repetition, you start to activate other areas of the brain that have to actually include some of the social areas and the areas that make you connected to certain things. So you actually not only are saying this thing, you're not saying this particular belief or this concept, but you're connecting with it in a very, very strong way, so that you not only kind of understand it cognitively, but you feel it, viscerally in your body. And that's why these practices become extremely powerful. And, going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, it is this indoctrination. This is how people create terrorists and things like that. It's a lot of repetition. It's a lot of ritual. And it's driving in these ideas about how they should be, how they should think about the world, that then makes it very, very difficult to break them out of it. It can be almost impossible. I mean, obviously the brain has plasticity. It can change. So it always can change. But sometimes it's very difficult to do that.
It's I've often wondered, how interesting it would be to be in your position and be able to look at how the mind works, because it is a really fascinating thing, and we live in a fascinating age. But I appreciate the work and the studies and everything that you do. But do you find it dishonest for people to use science maybe to try and justify their faith?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people should always be cautious about how they take anything. Anybody who looks at a particular study who wants to prove that one religion is right or one belief system is right or wrong, or that certain people are crazier than other certain people or whatever, I don't really like that personally. I mean, I think I always try to advocate that we need to be very cautious. Both ways, though. I mean, we shouldn't just say, well, because we caught it on a brain scan that there's nothing spiritual out there. But on the other hand, it certainly doesn't mean that there is something spiritual. We have to be very careful about going both ways. I've always tried to walk a pretty fine line down the middle and try to appreciate both perspectives. And I get both perspectives. I mean, I understand why people would want to do these different things, but certainly people should not co-opt science for for purposes that are not scientific. We should really adhere to science as careful. I think in the introduction we talked about keeping science rigorous, and I think that's really very critical. Yeah. But look, scientists are human beings too, and I've been in the medical field a long time, and I have seen lots of difficulty with people accepting new ideas and new. When I was going through medical school. The idea I always think about this, when you had an ulcer in your stomach, it was because of too much acid. And when the first studies came out that said no, it was a bacteria.
Wait, what kind of acid are we talking about?
Not a good one.
Oh, okay. All right, good. All right.
Too much stress, too much hydrochloric
There
acid.
we go.
But then people did some research and they found out that it was a bacteria. And when the first studies came out, those people were laughed out of the building, And nowadays, we treat people who have an ulcer in their stomach with an antibiotic because we know that it's a bacteria, or at least most people, it's because of that. So, scientists are not perfect either. I mean, we hope that all of us together are sort of searching for truth and
exactly.
We discard beliefs and ideas that are not well supported and not well founded. And that's why, I've always loved science. But I understand that data is a tricky thing, and what people consider to be data.
It is.
I love it when people say, "Well, there's no data that support that God exists." For example, I said, "Well, go to a church and ask people if they have data, that supports their beliefs." Well, they'll give you lots of data. Now, you may think that that's bad data, and that's fine, but it's data to them, So it's
shit. Which God?
That's true.
I've only got I'm just going to give you two more questions. This first one here it should be a quick answer. Do you prefer meditation, psychedelic drugs, or talking in tongues?
Personally, or for?
Yeah, for you personally, to get into an altered state.
I've only done one. So.
Is that the meditation?
No. No. I think we can guess that one.
I'll let you.
Well, this is the thing. I think one of the critical issues that is coming up in all of this research is which of these kinds of approaches are the most beneficial? And I think to some degree, each person has to find what works best for them. There are people who have drug-induced states, which are the most incredible experiences that they've ever had, change their life, change their sense of spirituality, change them as a person. That's great. There's other people who have bad trips and they never want to have that experience again. What was
And then there's people like me. I have a really hard time trying to talk in tongues. I actually had to write out what I said earlier,
right.
so it just does not flow for me.
And you had to take a hit, and that's all.
Naturally, they love it, and other people, they don't get it. Meditation. I know people who have come to me and said, "Hey, I've tried 6 different kinds of meditation. I don't get it. It's like it's weird. It's creepy. I don't like it." All right, well then, it's not for you.
It's not for you, exactly.
They say, I've tried 6 different meditations and everyone's better than the next. They're all terrific. I don't know.
That's awesome. All right, last question. I'll pass you off to Drew here, and we'll have the Andrew show going on.
Okay.
But I guess this is 2 questions kind of tied into one. How heavily do you think people rearrange their psychology, maybe their reasoning, in order to fit their beliefs? And if someone's looking for a spiritual awakening or like a sign or something like that, aren't they more likely to come across it if they're looking for it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that I wrote a book called Why We Believe What We Believe, and I mean, basically just said what you said. I mean, the idea that we develop a set of beliefs, and then of course once we have them, we use those beliefs as we start to look out onto the world. So we reject things that disagree with our beliefs, and we accept things that that support our beliefs. And of course, in today's world and the internet, you go to the websites that all say the things that not you, but one supports their beliefs and so forth. That if you're a Republican, then you go to all of the Republican websites and you hear how bad all the Democrats are. And if you're Democrat, you go the other way, and Christian and Jew, whatever. So, but it goes back to that. That neurons that fire together wire together. The idea that you really want to kind of support the beliefs and the neural connections that form in your brain, because they do. That's how it works, and it does become very difficult to break out. But again, one of my favorite examples where this happened was Einstein with quantum mechanics. He hated quantum mechanics. He tried desperately to disprove it. Every time he disproved it, he's just strengthened the argument for quantum mechanics, and yet he still refused, to the day he died, as far as I know, he refused to accept it. Here's the most brilliant man in history, arguably, and yet, he didn't like it. That classic God doesn't play dice with the universe. It just didn't make sense to him, and why not? So I think that we're all kind of guilty of that. We all do that. We're all just as guilty as the next person. And again, I mean, that's part of what I wanted to accomplish with books like Why We Believe What We Believe, The Metaphysical Mind, the idea that all of our brains are trying to understand this world. And, you look at certain philosophers who came to specific ideas about the world, that the world is only causal, that the world is all about willfulness, that the world is all about emotions, that it's all about rationality. Well, that's because those different philosophers looked at the world through that
different view.
So Immanuel Kant said everything has got this rationality to it. If you look at one of the philosophers named Schopenhauer talked about the will and the world as will. It was the book that he wrote. The idea, and you think about the brain in our frontal lobes is part of what behavior. And I think he looked at the world through that whole functioning of his frontal lobes, that everything in the world was about willfulness. Other people have looked at it through emotions. And then you get, like spiritual philosophical, just like Buddhism. Buddha was looking at it through suffering, the lens of suffering, and that kind of an emotion. So, we all kind of look at the world through the processes that our brain brings to bear on that world. And as you mentioned, I mean, we find a lot of the things that we want to find. And part of what I try to do in my works is to say, look, how do we challenge ourselves? How do we challenge our biases, our beliefs? How do we try to get outside of our own brain to look at the world in different ways, to try to make the argument for the other side, and try to ultimately respect what everybody comes to the table with, because each of us just has a brain trying to do the best job it can, and some of us come to one conclusion, some of us come to another, but we're still just doing the best we can at understanding the world.
Exactly. Well, I really appreciate your candor and your honesty and taking the time to answer these questions. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Great questions. Thank you.
Drew?
Real quick, Andrew, before Drew goes on here, do you got at least another 20 minutes? Because this interview is just really epic.
Sure, yeah.
You got like 20, 25 minutes? That'd be great, because I got some viewer submission questions I want to get to, and I know Drew has a few for you now, so it's probably like another 6 questions total to end this. Thank you.
Keep
Good,
my
Drew.
answer a little shorter.
No, I'm loving it. Seriously, you're drawing in. I'm like, okay, keep on going. Okay. Now you're doing great, man. I love it. I love this kind of stuff. Good, Drew.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say, man. I hope you aren't getting tired, because I got a couple of
for hours.
I got a couple of softballs to toss at you here. You touched, no, don't even. you touched on this earlier. You have a, I have a question that's kind of a little off the topic of religion, as a matter of, it's more of a matter of like skepticism, I guess you would say.
Sure.
And I just hope the question isn't too broad. The question is, how good are our brains at deciphering reality from fantasy?
It's a good question. In the book that I did, Why We Believe What We Believe, part of the case I was trying to make is that our brains are not very good at figuring out what's going on around us. People have done all kinds of studies to show how our emotions bias our ideas about the world, our perceptions. We continuously miss things in the world. We see things wrong. We hear things wrong. And one of the things I always like to say is that every time our brain makes a mistake, it never bothers to even tell us that it's made a mistake. So we just go about our happy lives thinking that everything looks right. And even though we may have, how many arguments have all of us had because we thought somebody meant something else, or we thought that they said something else. When a crime is committed and there's 20 witnesses, how often do all 20 stories all corroborate the same way? They're all looking at the same reality. So, and then ultimately, just philosophically speaking, it is an infinite universe. Our brains can, at best, hold on to about 4 or 5 pieces of information at any one time. So there is no way that our brain has any clear view of what's going on around us or what's going on in the world around us. Right now I'm sitting in this little, office, and what's going on in other parts of my house, I have no idea, let alone what's going on, in the Middle East and Russia and China. And so then somebody comes in and says, the Chinese government is terrible because of X. How do I know?
It's a great analogy. I like that.
It's very difficult. So, I mean, that's why I think being skeptical is critical. We should always ask a lot of questions. And part of what I also like to encourage, though, is that the basis of skepticism should always be constructive. How can I better understand this? How can I, as opposed to purely destructive? Look, I mean, obviously skepticism means you're asking questions, so there's a certain, criticality to it, which it should have. But it becomes, I always try to encourage people to, whenever I am reviewing something or looking at a grant or looking at an article, I always, how can we make it better? How can we make it clearer? How can we explain it in a different way, as opposed to, this just stinks. So, there's just different ways of being, and I think it's better when, as skeptics, and I'm skeptical too about all these things, but I try to keep an open mind. I try to be respectful and try to, see how I can use all of that information to come to a better place within my own beliefs.
Yeah. Hey, good answer. The second one here, I just wrote this one out. In your studies and everything that you've done, is there any evidence to suggest that people who are actually speaking in tongues are actually speaking some kind of unknown language? That's an interesting question. I did not actually analyze that, but I did look at the research literature, and to my knowledge, there have been a few studies that actually, recorded what people said and looked at it, and it doesn't have any clear linguistic structure like a normal language would have. So it doesn't appear to reflect any kind of, quote unquote, normal human language. So obviously, for those people who speak in tongues, they say, well, this is the language of God, and it's, goes beyond. But at least, from the perspective of kind of a normal human language, it does not appear, at least the analyses that have been done, don't, they don't have verbs and nouns and things, there's just, it's not really clear. From my own personal perspective, when I watched it, it goes back to one of the earlier questions that you asked. It is very repetitive often.
They use a lot of the same terms and sounds and stuff like that over and over again. You can kind of pick that up, and it's often much more like pressured. It becomes louder and more intense and so forth than when we're just kind of talking normally. But actually, as I found out, there are people who can kind of pray in tongues where it really sounds much more kind of conversational. But again, there's no clear linguistic structure to it.
Okay, so that just kind of might differ for different people and things like that.
Yeah, and it is different. I mean, when we looked at the different people who came into our lab to do the study, each of them did have different kinds of patterns that they used. So it wasn't just one kind of thing. And now what's interesting, and again, we can debate what the realness is of all of this, but there are apparently people who can try to interpret what it means, and people kind of derive spiritual meaning. It helps them to understand things a little bit more in their lives. So for those people where they can use it in a beneficial way, I guess that's good for them. But whether it's real or not, obviously, I certainly could never tell you.
Yeah.
But it was one of the more exciting studies I did, because obviously I had no idea. When people are meditating, they're just kind of sitting there quietly. I mean, here I got to watch something really so it was a lot of fun and interesting.
Oh, awesome. I guess, Joe, do I have time for at least one more?
Oh, you got a couple more, man. Keep on going. You're
Okay, yeah, because I have a few here. I've been just typing them out as you've been going.
Yeah, go, man.
Just a question I had for clarity. I saw an interview where you said that people aren't simply biological or material, but that they're also psychological, social, and spiritual. Right. And because the term spiritual is often used to mean a wide variety of things, I was kind of wondering what exactly you meant by that.
Well, what I meant was that that there is a part of ourselves, or the part of many people, that they consider to be a spiritual self, and in that regard, and to some degree, they consider that to be different than their psychological self and their biological self. So I think, and I was specifically speaking about it a little bit more in a healthcare kind of context, so that, because so often when I see patients and they come in, and patients who are dealing with cancer and things like that, the religious and spiritual side of themselves often comes into play, and obviously not for everybody, but for lots of people, it's a very important piece of that. And I think that it is important to understand that part of a person. As a doctor, as I'm taking care of somebody, I need to understand what that part is for that person, and maybe help them to utilize that in an effective way. And I would venture to guess that pretty much every physician has been asked by a patient at one point or another in their training to pray with them. And of course, the question then to me is, well, so what do you do with that? Do you say, oh, well, that's just a bunch of poppycock? I don't think that's a good. I mean, you may think that.
You can curse.
I love poppycock.
I was just going to say you can curse if you want, because we curse a lot on the show. So feel free if you like to.
Poppycock is pretty bad.
I like that. That was pretty funny.
I think that's a pretty hard word. But anyway, I mean, you could say it's a crock of shit, but the bottom is better. You're not going to say that to a patient. And now if you believe what they believe, you might engage them more directly. I've been asked to pray with patients, and oftentimes I'm not of that religion, and so I sit there quietly and I say, well, you lead it, or your family can do that, and I'll be more than happy to be here for you and to support you through that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think for me it's a matter of trying now, but again, I'm also. I'll walk that fine line. Maybe there is a spiritual part of ourselves. I have no data that points to the fact that there isn't. I certainly can show that we have a biological self and that we have a psychological and social self. Whether there's a soul or not, anybody's guess. There's some people who are trying to do some very interesting studies of near-death experiences, where sometimes people feel that they get outside of their body and float up in the corner of the room.
I've had that.
That theoretically is a testable thing. They're looking down on the room. We should be able to test whether or not the nurse really had red hair, or whether they saw a certain picture or something like that. And now again, that may not necessarily mean that we have a soul. It may have something to do with consciousness, or there's a lot. And again, this gets back to the metaphysical mind piece, that there may be different things that we don't understand about ourselves or about the world. And I think we have to just be cautious about saying, well, we're just biology or we're just psychology, and maybe there are these other parts of ourselves that we have difficulty generally connecting with. Or some people do, other people don't. I don't know.
Real quick on that aspect, sorry, Drew, is real quick, because this coming to my mind real quick. When it comes to spirituality, I could be in a boat fishing, hunting, whatever, and I feel one with nature. I feel like this all, like this is so great. It's peaceful. It's like, now I consider that me being spiritual with nature itself. I feel that. I feel that, like that tingling. You feel comfort. You feel peace. You feel good, and you're out there. I understand that. That's what I would consider myself being spiritual.
Sure. Well, one of the and it gets back again to this metaphysical minds and neurotheology. One of the exercises I do with people in my classes and talks that I've given is I go up on the board and I write spirituality on one side and religiousness on the other side, and I say, now define these terms. And and encourage you guys to try it too with your listeners or whatever. Yeah. It's fascinating because you always get a different definition, and there's lots of people who believe spirituality is exactly what you said. And in fact, and then they would go on to say, but it's not really spirit, it's just me connecting to the world or the universe. There are a lot of scientists who look at the world that way. And, that's great. And obviously there's other people who say spirituality is connecting to God or something supernatural. And all different variations in between. People have told me music is their spirituality, art, creativity, their family. And, so everybody defines these ideas in terms differently, and that's part of what I'm actually working on now, which is trying to better differentiate what people mean when they say, I had a spiritual experience.
Yes.
And you mentioned the question earlier, is there a real difference, or what are the differences and similarities between the LSD trip, the speaking in tongues trip, the meditation trip, the near-death experience trip? How are they similar? How are they different? And what's going on physiologically? How do they transform a person differently? Is there something spiritual that's different about one that's different, compared to the others? There's a lot of great questions that we're just scratching the surface on.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I have one more here for you, and then I'll pass you back to Joe for the viewer questions. Let's see. I've heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the more a person focuses on an idea or belief, the more wired into their psyche it becomes, and that it will literally change the brain chemistry. And I'm wondering, kind of a two-part question. I'm wondering what exactly is happening there, and also does this help explain why people that have been religious or extremely religious and fundamentalist for so long have such a hard time, maybe even abandoning that later on in their life?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes to both. There are specific mechanisms that have been worked out. So there are things called interneurons that release different neurochemicals and different neurotransmitters that help to strengthen different connections and bring different, the ends of different neurons together and so forth. So there is an actual physiological process by which the more different neurotransmitters go across and connect between different neurons, that strengthens the connection. And then other connections which are not used, they actually start to kind of wither and disappear. So there is an actual physiological process, but then yes, ultimately what gets wired into your brain, especially when you're hearing about it from the age of 4 or 5 years old and you're going to church or whatever, those neural connections are pretty darn strong. And, again, doesn't mean you can't break out of them. And there are conversions and there are people who, suddenly reject their religion or suddenly, have a conversion experience and become religious or whatever. But they don't happen very often, and they are, people hold on to their beliefs very, very strongly, and often for, very long parts of their lives, if not their whole life.
Awesome. It's all yours, Joe.
There you go, man. Great.
Yeah.
All right, Andrew, we got 3 viewer submission questions, and we're pretty much done here. My first one is, and I got this off Facebook. I promoted you on Facebook, and I said, who has a question for Andrew? Let's go. So I got 3 good ones here I'm going to go over. First one is by Dragnot Savlius. Is he able to discern mental instability from religious experience and have evidence to support the dichotomy, if there is any?
I mean, I haven't personally done that kind of research, and I'm not sure exactly what he means by mental instability.
Either do I, yeah.
You know, again, it kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier on in the program, that, you know, part of the real question here becomes, you know, how do we decide whether a religious belief or a set of beliefs that a person holds is adaptive, maladaptive, real, not real, good, bad, and so forth. There's certainly data that supports that people who are religious often use that religion as a way of coping, as a way of reducing anxiety and depression. And in that regard, religion often provides stability in their brain. Certainly, there are plenty of examples where people become less stable because of, you know, they become more anger-filled, more hate-filled, and so forth. They're willing to do all kinds of things that, you know, quote unquote, a normal person wouldn't normally do. And then there are some interesting examples. We haven't talked about this, but there are some interesting examples of pathological conditions, like certain people with seizures, schizophrenia, mania, where people have particularly unusual religious or spiritual patterns of beliefs, and that can be, you know, it's associated with the pathology, and then you get into all these kind of, you know, to me, there's some weird permutations here. You know, can you have a schizophrenic patient who has a quote unquote normal spiritual experience? Can you have a otherwise normal person who has an abnormal spiritual experience? And of course, you know, can you have a normal person who's got normal spirituality and an abnormal person who's got abnormal spirituality? Sure. But there's a lot of different overlaps and a lot of different permutations that make it very challenging to always know whether religion and spirituality is good, bad, for any given individual.
Great. So, Dreadnought, there you go. And my next one is going to be from Danny Poole. My question is, what's the reason behind why Christians are watering down the Bible? Is it a guilt trip or what?
Are watering down the Bible?
He said, what's the reason behind why Christians are watering down the Bible? Like watering down the Bible? Is it a guilt trip or what?
Well, you know, it gets back to one of the other questions about, you know, how do we use our beliefs to figure out and to bias the information that we have coming to us. So, yeah, you know, I mean, obviously every person is different, and some people water things down, other people don't. Some people are very strict adherents, other people aren't. You know, I'm always fascinated at the lines people draw as to, you know, what they're willing to do or not do or accept or not accept. You know, it's a fascinating question ultimately because there's so much interindividuality in regard to these issues. But that's part of where this kind of research, this idea of neurotheology and neurometaphysics and so forth, can kind of look at to try to understand how people take reality and why they take it in certain ways, how it works for them beneficially, how it works for them detrimentally, and it hopefully will teach us a lot about ourselves, a lot about what's good and bad about
religion
systems, and you know, maybe we'll learn a little bit about reality in the process too.
No, absolutely, great, man. Well said. And my last viewer question here is this, and it's from Keith Caloria. I don't know how to pronounce it, Caloria. And I didn't really get this question, but maybe you do. Why does he relate brain? Let me rephrase that. Why does he relate brain pattern changes when somebody speaks in tongues or prays to a spiritual experience? Is that the only answer available?
Well, no. I mean, I hopefully I didn't make that inference. I mean, obviously, that's one. You know, we talked about this earlier. I mean, that's one conclusion. Somebody could look at the brain and say, okay, well, you know, here's the brain when the person speaks in tongues, and if they think that, you know, this is how God moves through them, then this is, you know, how our spirituality ultimately kind of manifests in the context of our biology. But I'm also totally comfortable with saying, hey, you know, this is a physiological process. It's a brain process, and you know, nothing more than that. You know, that's as legitimate a conclusion as the other one.
Yeah.
I don't think we can make a clear determination simply on the basis of the brain scan. Now, we can start to try to use these scans and maybe try to look at, what's really happening. Maybe we can come up with other subjective measures. If somebody says God is in the room, is there a way to take a photograph? I don't know. I'm a never say never kind of guy. If we haven't figured it out yet, it doesn't mean we can't. It just means we haven't done, come up with methods and studies to be able to do it. And maybe there's some things we'll never know, or maybe we have to come up with, a whole different way. I mean, that's part of what, to me, neurotheology is about, the idea of, how do we use our own contemplative processes, drug-induced experiences, near-death experiences, neuroscience, how do we use it all to kind of come together to tell us something about reality? Since, again, at least in my own view, I haven't found, one particular path that seems to have a lock on what reality is all about. So I kind of say, well, we got to use a little bit of the best of all worlds. And I don't know what the relative ratios are. I mean, maybe it's 98% science and 2% spirituality. Maybe it's 50-50. I don't know. But to me, I think, for myself, I feel like I have to just keep pressing on the questions keep exploring them, and I do a lot of my own philosophical thinking. That's what led to the metaphysical mind, and my own spiritual pursuits, and some of that's going out to the mountains and looking at a beautiful sunset, and some of it's meditation, and some of it's just kind of connecting with the world and people around me, and then continuing to do the science, and how do we learn about the brain and these different experiences and practices, and what do they do for us, and maybe we'll figure out the answer someday. I think it's going to take a lot of people to figure it out. I'm certainly not going to do it all by myself, I don't think.
No,
I think I'm really lucky.
No, I mean, that's why we do this stuff here. So go. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
you're good. That's all I got. Awesome, man. I got one more question, real quick one. If you want to keep it down to a minute, Bill Maher, he cut you. He cut you a lot. It seemed like he cut religious a lot. So
he did.
You want to maybe give us a little some here, like what you told him, but wasn't in the movie. Come on.
I actually loved my conversation. We and this happens in any.
Oh yeah.
Movie. I mean, you talk for an hour and a half and they cut it down to 30 seconds. So I expected that. I have no problem with that.
Oh yeah, it was good.
To be honest, I mean, the only thing I was kind of disappointed, we had a great discussion. I mean, we were talking about all kinds of things we were just talking about on this program, about the nature of reality and what's real and what's not. And, we talked about what crazy means, and whether, everyone who's religious is crazy, and whether all of us are just crazy, and the figuring out what's truth and real. That all of our brains make mistakes, and none of us really have a lock on it. And in fact, actually, a lot of the basis for his movie, the idea of I think he said it in the trailer at least, and different parts of the movie was I don't know.
Yes, correct. That's his philosophy. Yeah, I don't know. He said to his mom, yeah, I just don't know. I subscribe to the I don't know church or something like that. He said, yeah.
And I completely agree. To me, one of the things I talked about in my book, Principles of Neurotheology, is that a critical piece of it is what I like to refer to as a passion for inquiry. It's asking the questions, and that implies that you don't know, and you're going to keep asking the questions until you find an answer that you think is a decent one. And then once you find the decent one, you're going to keep asking questions. Absolutely. Because there's going to be another slightly better one that's down the road. So,
I wish we could keep asking questions.
I know, really, right? I'm loving it. I love this interview. I think it was so awesome, man. I love it. That being said, Dr. Andrew Newberg, thank you very much for being our special guest tonight. Man. It was a pleasure, and it was a great time as usual.
I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks.
Yes,
guys.
It was great. And maybe I come to Philadelphia. I only live 15 minutes. Maybe we'll go get a dinner and chat a little bit if you want. Got your phone number and stuff, so we can go do that. But when we're in closing here, guys, let's give a great, big thumbs up in the chat room right now for Dr. Andrew Newberg. His website is www.andrewnewberg.com. Is that the best place for people to purchase your book?
Yeah, they can go there. I mean, Amazon for the Metaphysical Mind, and Amazon has most of the other books as well, or you can get it through the website. That's fine.
Correct.
Is it www or www, Joe?
www.andrewnewberg.com. I knew he was going to say that.
Sorry, it was the third one in the row.
See what I got? Andrew, see what I got to put up with every show? This guy right here, TJ, you know what I mean? But no, what I'll do is I'll include the website, of course, and the Amazon link, and also our fan base here is great. They purchase books, and they love the guests that we've had on. And your latest book, of course, is The Metaphysical Mind, Probing the Biology of Philosophical Thought. Guys, please support Andrew here and his research and findings in neurotheology. Andrew, it was a pleasure to have you as our guest tonight. Thank you for your time, and we thank you for the work that you do and the books that you write.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
Take care.